Nicole Barrett presents Blessed Stanley Rother, a Saint in the Family, at the 2018 Lenten Series.
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming out tonight. I really am honored to get the invitation to come and be a part of this presentation. I am a relative, as Sister said, of Father Rother's. Unfortunately, I never got to know him, but I've gotten to know his siblings that are still living and was an honored guest of theirs at the beatification. So I'll share a little bit of that and my kind of that personal connection throughout. When I started speaking about Father Rother, it was prior to many people knowing anything about him. Now there's a lot of stuff out there because of the beatification we had in September, but I'll try to add some little perspectives maybe that you don't see. Are we okay on? Okay. Or that haven't been in the press quite as much. I have lots of things you can look at over here and some things you can have over here, and I'll pass around a few things throughout. So I'm going to dive right in because I'm going to try to be on time. I'm a little nervous about that, and I do have some video clips that I'm going to show you throughout, including a video of him and one of him talking and some things like that, which I think, and if you were here last week, when Father was talking about Padre Pio, I think that's one of the great appeals is that these are modern day saints. These are people that we know that we can connect to, that lived during our lifetime. Father Stan certainly has a lot that we can sort of connect to. He did live from 1935 to 1981. And today we're going to look at, I sort of segment his story into him as a farmer, a pastor, and a martyr, and then also as a shepherd. And that's what he thought of himself as. And you'll notice that through some of the names of the books and things. So we'll talk about that. We're then going to talk, I like stories. I think stories make it personal. And there's some really interesting stories about kind of how people learned of his martyrdom. And then we'll talk a little bit about the canonization process. So he's a local guy, right? He's from right here in the Midwest. So my pointer doesn't show up on this screen, but if you can see the little olive-colored dot, that is actually where he grew up, in Okarche, Oklahoma, which is that red point just northwest of Oklahoma City. It's a very small town along Highway 81. Our ancestors grew up primarily in Humphrey, Nebraska, which also is on 81, and then some of them went down and homesteaded in Oklahoma. They were very close, and they used to travel that undeveloped road between the two. We've got lots of great stories about that. In fact, my grandparents, for their honeymoon, went from Humphrey to Okarche to visit relatives. So it was a multi-day drive. They took my great-grandmother along, and that was the honeymoon. So quick picture of Stan as an infant, and then a great little story by his parents of the day he was born. He's the oldest.
I'll never forget. We had the worst dust storm that we had during the Dust Bowl days. And the day that Stan was born, I had my firstborn colt, baby colt. And he had his leg broken. We had to splint the colt the same day that Stan was born. I thought, boy, is life going to be like this? Have a baby one day and have a dust storm and a broken leg on a colt the same day.
His dad, or his parents, had a farmhouse that's still in the family today. I'll show you pictures of it later. It's beautiful. I've been there. So like most babies born in the Depression, he was born at home. And then, and dust storm. So Dad took him immediately into the church in Okarche, or pretty quickly, to be baptized. So mom stays at home. It's not the way we have big celebrations today, but dad goes in to get Stan baptized. If you noticed, his dad's name was Franz. His grandfather on that side, I'm related on the mother's side. His grandfather, I think, was Francis, and they had a history of the eldest son being named some derivative of Francis. His parents decided to change that and name him Stanley Francis Rother. So dad takes him in to be baptized, and the priest says, nope, there's a rule. You have to baptize a baby after a saint. And so while his birth certificate says Stanley Francis, his baptismal certificate, at the insistence of the parish priest, is Francis Stanley. He is now slated to be the first Saint Stanley. So kind of an ironic twist of fate there. This is the family church where he received most of his sacraments and where he said his first Mass. So beautiful church, kind of the center of this small town, really not unlike Humphrey. If any of you have been there, the two towns resemble each other a lot. I think they have the same sort of feel, and probably our German ancestors, and we had family that kind of helped establish both communities. So just a few fun pictures of him growing up. And I think I might have these in a different order than on here. So this is Stan and his next sister. She was born Elizabeth Mary, but then she went on to the convent. So she is now Sister Marita. They're 14 months apart, and they were very close growing up. These are the four siblings. So there is Marita, that's what I know her as, so that's what I'm going to call her. Stan, James, and Tom. They also had a sister, Carolyn, that died as an infant. James died of leukemia in 1974. So still living is Marita and Tom. Tom still lives on the family farm. He just retired a couple years ago, but he helps out, and his boys do most of the farming. But he and his wife live in the house. Growing up, Stan was known as a quiet, tender-hearted boy. His sister tells a story. In fact, they were a hardworking farm family, and then the kids went into Catholic school. And so they'd get up, they'd do chores in the morning, which is typical, and then they'd rush to get ready for school. Small one-room or two-room schoolhouse, so sister and Stan were always in the same classroom. And she tells a story one day of him wearing a coat and had it all zipped up. And she was kind of perplexed, like, gosh, he's got to be hot. What's going on? And the nun that was teaching their class kept telling him, Stan, you need to take your coat off. Stan, you need to take your coat off. And finally, he obeys, and he takes it off, and his eyes well with tears because he still has his pajamas top on. He didn't have enough time to change for school, and it just was heartbreaking to him and embarrassing. So just a really tender-hearted guy. But he worked really hard on the farm, too, like farm kids do, and that translates into his whole story. Tom tells a story about that. He tells a story one day of a pig that was sort of free range on the farm that starts getting into the flower beds and rooting around. And Franz, their dad, throws a rock at it to try to get it to move out of the flower beds, hits it just right on the head, kills it. So he tells Stan, butcher the pig. And that's what Stan did, because that's what farm boys do, right? So he butchered the pig to make sure they weren't going to waste it. They were going to use that food to feed the family. So definitely a hardworking, milked the cows, fixed anything. Church was also very important. This is Stan with his rosary. Here he is as an altar boy. So family and church were their two big hallmarks. A lot of vacations they took were to grandparents and relatives just in the area, out in the community. And all of this really framed who he would become and what type of missionary he would be. This is his senior high school picture. He enjoyed high school a lot. He dated, he had a lot of friends. They used to go to Kingfisher, which is the next biggest town just north of Okarche. And so they'd go there on Friday nights after ball games and stuff. This was pre-Vatican II, so they would wait till after midnight so they could get burgers and then try to get home before curfew. Let's see. But his senior year, without any prior disclosure to his parents or his family, he told his parents that he would be going to the seminary after graduation. They were kind of surprised, and because they hadn't heard anything about it before. And his dad's initial response was, "Why did you take FFA in high school then? Like, what was the point of that?" He was very close with his sister, but he had not even disclosed to her that he was going to enter religious life. Coincidentally, she was having the same contemplation and calling from God, so she told her parents within a few weeks that she too would be leaving to go to the convent. So she did her senior year of high school actually at the convent. They left the house within a few weeks of each other. Kind of challenging for the parents just to lose both their oldest children at the same time. But she would actually eventually go on. She joined the Adorers of the Blood out of Wichita, and she served in David City, Nebraska for quite a few years. She was the principal of St. Mary's there and then taught. They remained close through their entire life. They wrote a lot, and Sister told me that she always kept the letters that Stan would send her in a shoebox in the trunk of her car. And for years, even after he died, she just couldn't get herself to do anything with those letters. They stayed there until the cause was opened for his canonization, and then most of them were turned over for the Pastillo to go to the Vatican. Let's see here. So Stan, after graduation, went to Assumption Seminary in Texas. He struggled academically. It was hard. And like most of us, when something's difficult and we're not enjoying it, he procrastinated and found other things to do with his time. And so he did what he knew how to do well. He worked the land, he helped them, he gardened, he fixed things. He did stuff to occupy his time more than focusing on his studies. And eventually it caught up with him and he failed out of the seminary. He was unable to learn Latin, and all of the textbooks at that time were in Latin. And so he failed theology and was sent home back to Oklahoma to find a new profession. He went back to the farm. That's what he knew to do. And so like past summers while he was in the seminary, he helped his dad with the farm. But he talked to the bishop and he said he was still called to be a priest. He knew it, and he begged the bishop to help him find another seminary to go to because he really felt like he was to be a priest. And so the bishop got him into Mount St. Mary's Seminary in Maryland, which is where many of our diocesan priests go, including Father Heaslip right back here. So we went to the seminary there and did struggle there as well. He finished, he was ordained, but he still had a little bit of a hard time, and so he also did other things that he found more enjoyable. So he worked the grounds there. He built the grotto and the Stations of the Cross out there, so some of his handiwork is still visible out on the seminary grounds. He also played sports and did other fun things. He wasn't particularly talented at it, but he liked to play basketball and stuff with the other seminarians. So these are a few pictures from there, and him and Sister. I'm just making sure I didn't miss anything. He was known for having a dry sense of humor. but a good sense of humor. He liked to play pranks on people. He also kept a journal throughout his life and during his seminary time. That's been really helpful through the cause for canonization. And again, he was writing a lot of letters back to his sister and to the rest of his family. So this is him on ordination. And then we're going to watch just the quickest video. You will see him in the back. My pointer won't work, but you'll see him walking out after his ordination. There he is. On his ordination card, he put this quote, for my own sake, I am a Christian. For the sake of others, I am a priest. And I think that's just so prophetic. My grandfather was at his ordination. So I do have an ordination card, which is now a relic. I'll pass it around. This is the one my grandfather received, and I have since inherited. About the time that he was being ordained, the Pope was putting a call out for dioceses in the United States and in other first world countries to develop missions in some of the third world and struggling countries. So this was happening about the same time, and within 5 years, Stan would be down there at the mission that Oklahoma developed. But first, he went back to the farm after ordination. So today, or in our diocese, most of the priests, when they are ordained, pretty quickly know what their first assignment is. That's not the way it was at that time. At that time, also, Oklahoma was one diocese for the entire state. So they would wait several months before they would get their assignment. So he did what he knew how to do. He went back to the farm, he helped his parents. His first assignment then ended up being a small parish down close to the Arkansas and Texas border, where he was assigned to develop some land that had been gifted to the diocese. And I need to look at my notes to make sure I don't miss. Oh, I have it on here. Sorry. Probably really making this difficult for Father there. So it was Lake Texoma. And they had been gifted this land, and they decided they wanted to put like a retreat center there. They had no budget and no plan. So in addition to his parish duties, he cleared the trees, he built a center, he recruited volunteers, some of which were Native Americans in the area. And so he spent all of his free time bonding with the people there, in particular the Native Americans, and getting help to build this retreat center. It is still used by the diocese today, and it was one of his huge successes, and it built on his strengths as a farmer and the things he knew how to do. But not everybody was impressed with his efforts and the way he went about this. In fact, a senior priest in the diocese said to the bishop, and it got back to Stan, he said, we may have made a mistake in ordaining Father Rother. And that just cut to Stan's heart. As I mentioned, he was very tenderhearted. That was very hard for him to hear, that people thought the efforts that the bishop went through to find a new seminary were not worthwhile. About 5 years into his tenure as a priest, he volunteered to join the Oklahoma mission in Santiago Atitlan in Guatemala. And so you can sort of see the area by that dot. This is where their mission was established. In Guatemala, we can see it, that sort of big lake with a couple, those are actually volcanoes surrounding it, and I'll zoom in. So it's this area right here. It's this lake, and those are volcanoes, and I will show you again closer. So here's the lake and the volcanoes around it. It is a beautiful part of the country, I am told. I have not yet been down there, but I know from people that have gone to Guatemala just on tourist things that this lake, Lake Atitlan, is one of the must-see tourist things. Most people take boat trips and different things on this lake. So this is where the mission was at.
I think the parish there in Guatemala is very special. The people are very special. About 95% of the people are Indian, Mayan Indians. And of those, about 75%, as much as we can tell, are Catholic.
That was Stan's voice describing the mission and the people. And then this is a close-up of the church building. It was built in the mid-1500s by Spanish monks. It was a little bit run down. Father Rother fixed it up. And it is now a historic site. All the missionaries, so it was built in the mid-1500s, all the missionaries had been run out of the country by 1871. And it took nearly 100 years until the Oklahomans established a mission there for them to have another priest. So even though he said, that high percentage of Catholics, they withstood that faith without any priest there. The parish size, by 1975, Father Stan was actually the only Oklahoma priest left at the mission. Occasionally, he would have an assistant. The parish size was 25,000 Catholics during Father Rother's time, but it was growing constantly. So we had lots of little mission churches around the area. What he would do was he would train catechists and to help him, and then the catechist would sort of go out and help him do the various mission work that was to be done. Here's another picture of the church. The church is named for St. James the Apostle, and this is decorated for a celebration in July. The culture centered around the Catholic Church for over 400 years, so very centered to their culture. Like he describes, they are mostly Mayan Indians. Specifically, there are actually 3 different branches of Mayan Indians, and these are the Tezuhil, which are some of the more peaceful if you sort of study a little bit on Mayans. So most of the population was Tezuhil, and then some of it was Latinos or Spanish-speaking, Spanish derivatives. So another picture of the people. So Father Stan, who failed out of the seminary because he couldn't learn Latin, actually learned to speak Tezuhil and Spanish fluently. And so he was able to converse, to say Mass, to minister to the people in both languages. And knowing the irony of that, he actually was quoted as saying, "The Holy Spirit must have a sense of humor." He was referred to by the people as either Padre Francisco or Papa Oplis. So those languages don't necessarily have a translation for Stan, so they actually did the Francis translation. One of the things he did, one of the many things he did when he was at the mission was he finished a project started by his predecessor of creating a written language for Tezuhil. So prior to their existence, this language had never been written. So they established an alphabet and a written language for it. And then he translated all the liturgical books, the prayer books, the New Testament, and he said Mass then in both Latin or in Tezuhil and Spanish. So unbelievably incredible. So a little bit about Stan the farmer, because it plays such a huge part into what he did. And I like to, and a few of you have heard me speak before, so you may have heard this, but I really like to do a comparison or sort of reminisce on what it truly means to be a farmer. And I think that we can get that sometimes the best by that poem from Paul Harvey on God making a farmer. And so I'll sort of make the connections throughout, but I have a little montage of some farm video or farm pictures of Stan, both in Oklahoma and Guatemala, and sort of to that poem. So if you bear with me.
The 8th day, God looked down on his planned paradise and said, I need a caretaker. So God made a farmer. God said, I need somebody willing to get up before dawn, milk cows, work all day in the fields, milk cows again, eat supper, then go to town and stay past midnight at a meeting of the school board. So God made a farmer. I need somebody with arms strong enough to wrestle a calf and yet gentle enough to deliver his own grandchild. Somebody to call hogs, tame cantankerous machinery, come home hungry, have to wait lunch until his wife's done feeding visiting ladies, then tell the ladies to be sure and come back real soon and mean it. So God made a farmer. God said, I need somebody willing to sit up all night with a newborn colt and watch it die and dry his eyes and say, maybe next year. I need somebody who can shave an axe handle from a persimmon sprout, shoe a horse with a hunk of car tire, who can make harness out of hay wire, feed sacks, and shoe scraps, who planting time and harvest season will finish his 40-hour week by Tuesday noon, and then painting from tractor back put in another 72 hours. So God made a farmer. God had to have somebody willing to ride the ruts at double speed to get the hay in ahead of the rain clouds and yet stop in midfield and brace to help when he sees the first smoke from a neighbor's place. So God made a farmer. God said, I need somebody strong enough to clear trees and heave bales, yet gentle enough to eat lambs and wean pigs and tend the pink-combed pullets who would stop his mower for an hour to splint the broken leg of a meadowlark. It had to be somebody who would plow deep and straight and not cut corners, somebody to seed, weed, feed, breed, and rake and disc and plow and plant and tie the fleece and strain the milk and replenish the self-feeder and finish a hard week's work with a 5-mile drive to church. Somebody who'd bail a family together with the soft, strong bonds of sharing, who would laugh and then sigh and then reply with smiling eyes when his son says that he wants to spend his life doing what Dad does. So God made a farmer.
And even though he told his dad he was going to be a priest, he continued to be a farmer for the rest of his life, both literally and figuratively using those skills. I also think it's ironic because Paul Harvey is an Oklahoma boy as well, from the Tulsa area, growing up at the same time frame. So here are a couple pictures of the farms and the farmers in Guatemala. Very literally, Stan was a farmer in Guatemala. So he taught the people at his mission how to farm well, and he farmed side by side with them, having a small plot to grow food for the needy. He implemented an irrigation system for them in Guatemala. He set up crop sharing, which was the first bit of property rights that any of them had known. That didn't bode well for him with the government. They don't like property rights, but that was something that he established for them. And he would often write home to his dad, the farmer, talking about and asking advice on new varietals to try, different ways to farm to deal with the climate and the Guatemalan terrain. He also, he loved his people. He went to their homes. He ate with them. Whatever they ate, he ate. So they would farm, but poverty was tremendous. They also ate whatever else they could get a hold of. So that could be bugs, that could be mud, that could be any number of other things that they would do, and he ate it. The nuns and the people in the hospital would beg him not, His digestive system was certainly not acclimated to that. It would make him very sick. But he found it to be very insulting to not eat what the people would offer him and what they were eating. So he would do it regardless. So Father the pastor, obviously he had a church ministry, and I mentioned before the size of his ministry and the use of catechists to assist him in that. But he did everything a priest would do in terms of ministering to the people. So all of their sacraments, they kind of have some cool traditions. Confirmation is on Pentecost. So that's the day they all have their confirmation. And all of the first communions and the weddings happen on July 25th, the Feast of St. James. So they would have this enormous festival for the Feast of St. James. And that's the day they would do all of the first communions and the weddings. So guys didn't have to worry about trying to remember what the anniversary day was. Everybody has the same one. He would visit the sick. He would say Mass literally for thousands between the main church and then the satellite churches. He kept the rectory unlocked, and parishioners could come anytime, day or night, when they needed any sort of help, and he would do it. So he had a hospital that was eventually named after him. You can see that in the picture. I don't know what's going on with my cursor. Oh, that is not what I wanted to do. Sorry, I just want to, I guess, use the touch screen. So they had no doctors at the hospital. It was run by the Carmelite nuns. And he would be a patient there when he would get sick from the conditions, the food, the water, etc. In 1972, actually, he was in solitary confinement, receiving IVs for infectious hepatitis. So definitely would get sick. With his trademark humor, at the end of the letter he wrote to his family back during that time frame, he instructed them to wash their hands after reading the letter. He often donated blood at the hospital. In fact, the day that he died, he had planned to go and donate blood because one of his parishioners was going to have surgery that day. There was a school that he helped establish. And in addition to reading and writing, he taught skills like carpentry. In particular, he was very concerned about children that were orphaned or children whose fathers had died in the war and things like that. So he felt like they needed to learn a trade. They needed to learn how to farm and build and do something to make money. So really was a trade school of sort for the children. There was a nutrition center, and he would teach the mothers about nutrition in particular, or make sure that they were taught. One of his initiatives was to get the mothers that were using formula to stop using powdered formula, because they would make it with the water that was contaminated, and then the kids would get sick and the babies would die. So he was teaching them about that and that they needed to do something different. So I mentioned that people could come to him with any problem, and they did. And so one story that I love was about a couple that came to Father one day with a baby they had had. Her name was Maria. She was about 4 pounds. She was very ill, and they didn't think that she would survive or they could care for her. So they left her with Father to take care of, and he took her in, and he took care of her, and he changed diapers, and he got the nuns and other volunteers to help, but he got up during the night, and he helped nurse her back to health and up to over 6 pounds, and once she was healthy enough, he found a family to adopt her. He kept in contact with her family, And in fact, one of the books I have here, The Shepherd Cannot Run, is a collection of his letters. And there's a letter here that he wrote to her parents when she was several years old. So, I mean, he did whatever he needed to do. And I just think that's incredibly cool. Father loved children. This was kind of his strength. Children and old people were his specialty. He was said to have a stern face, but a big heart. And people knew that they could come to him for help with anything. He would often have kids in tow, and he was so much taller than them. And I just sort of have these visions, I don't know if they're accurate, but like of kind of the Pied Piper or whatever, with all these children behind him, as it's been described. He would tap them on their heads and get down at their level like this and play with them. But make no mistake, he was not perfect. He had a temper. People knew that, and he knew that. And I love this. At one point, he actually asked one of the nuns at the mission what they thought he should do to help control his temper. And this nun said, "Well, Father, I think you should pray about it." And it just seems, we're here talking about this guy on the path to sainthood who's been declared a martyr, and he has to be reminded that maybe he should pray to help get over his temper. And when I was telling this story at a family reunion this summer to share his story with some of my relatives that don't know, my uncle interrupted and said, "I think that's the Werner temper." So it is in our family. I can attest to that. But he did consciously, until the day he died, work to sort of overcome that. And at the very good advice of one of the nuns, he prayed about it. So Father the martyr, the military presence. I have a great little video clip that I'm going to show out of the latest documentary that sort of explains what was going on with the military. So I think it'll play automatically here.
He put his whole being into it, he put his whole heart into it. And that obviously became apparent when things began to change.
The country here is in rebellion, and the government is taking it out on the church.
It's from a letter
The
he
low
wrote
wages
home.
that are paid, the very few who were excessively rich, the bad distribution of the land. These are some of the reasons for widespread discontent. The church seems to be the only force that's trying to do something about the situation, and therefore the government is after us.
In the context of Guatemala, the ruling class would begin to characterize those who worked with the poor as being communist sympathizers. And with that, the church began to become a target of persecution. The violence didn't come to Santiago until really 1980.
The army has moved into the town, and they have a town meeting stating that they were there to protect the people, to keep them from insurgents. Father Stanley was listening to him politely, and then as soon as he said the word protect, his hand shoots up and he says, "If you're here to protect, why are my people disappearing? That wasn't happening before you arrived here."
The tactic of the government has been to kidnap those they think are leaders, torture them, and kill them. We had just witnessed the kidnapping of someone we had gotten to know and love, and were unable to do anything about it. They had his mouth covered. I could still hear his muffled screams for help.
For him, it was always about being their shepherd, being their pastor. And I think he struggled with how to minister to them in that violence.
So some of that was a letter that he had written home that somebody is reading for us. But that was sort of what was going on. If you are familiar with Central America and Guatemalan history, sort of at this time in the late 70s and early 80s, tremendous violence. And as they described there, people were being kidnapped and tortured and killed. And that was certainly happening to, as stated, his parishioners, in particular his catechist, We heard the letter describing one of his catechists, him actually witnessing it and not being able to do anything. And again, that just tore on his heart. So they would torture them, and then they would kill them, and then they would leave them for dead just wherever. And so Father would go out daily walking to look for his parishioners' bodies and to bring them back and to give them a proper burial. So this is sort of what that would look like. And that was part of his daily plan. So Diego was one of the catechists he's describing in there that was tortured, murdered, and he witnessed. He was standing on the rectory steps, but he couldn't intervene. So as this was happening, many priests were fleeing for their safety. Father knew that he too may need to go, but he really felt called to be with his people and to protect them. But he was also a priest who had taken a vow of obedience. So he told his bishop that if he was told to leave, that he would obey if there was a direct threat on his life. But otherwise, he needed to stay with his people. And in a letter to a dear friend who often helped at the mission in November of 1980, he says, "At first signs of danger, the shepherd can't run and leave the sheep to fend for themselves." That was his view. So that's what he did. And he repeated that in letters and interviews for the rest of his life. But meanwhile, he had this great concern about his assistant pastor. So he doesn't want to leave, but he doesn't want his assistant pastor that he has at that time to be harmed. That man was a Tizuhil Mayan. So he started working on getting him a visa so that he could leave the country. In January of 1981, there was a direct threat put out on Stan's life, and at the instruction of his bishop, he obediently returned to his home. So this is the home. When he went back to Okarchi, he spent time with his parents, but he visited family. He went to a missionary meeting in Mexico. He went up to Wichita to visit his sister. And then he was invited to preach at several of his friends' churches. And so at one particular church, he was candid about what was happening in his mission and what was happening in the country. And unfortunately, there were some people in the congregation at Mass that Sunday that did not like what Father was saying. So they wrote a letter to the bishop, and they wrote a letter to the embassy, alleging that he was anti-American, that he was sympathizing with communists, that maybe he was involved in liberation theology. And these things, while there's no way to know for sure, certainly there is speculation that further expedited the threat on his life, unfortunately. So during this time, he also says, "I want to return soon," meaning back to the mission, but then I might not be given the chance to escape again. The big question is, should I take a chance and go back? Nobody has yet convinced me to stay here. And that is his signature, by the way, kind of cool. So here's a quick little video. It's only video footage I have of him. It's pretty cool to see him discussing that as well.
If you could go back there next week and do what you wanted to do.
In a taped interview shortly before he returned to Guatemala, he was asked about the shape of his ministry if he were to go back to his mission.
With the present political situation, that's hard to determine right now. You're aware that 2.5 months, almost 3 months ago, because of the political situation in the country, I had to leave. And I think when I go back, whenever that will be, my ministry will be different.
He did go back for Holy Week. So with the blessing of his bishop, he returned for Holy Week to celebrate Holy Week and Easter with his parishioners. But things changed after he went back. He slept in a different room than he had for the previous 13 years because it was safer. He began locking the rectory. In May of that year, he returned to Oklahoma for the final time for the ordination of his cousin, Don Wolf, cousin on the other side, and for that first Mass. And if you watch the beatification, Father Wolf was actually involved in the beatification. He's at St. Eugene's Parish in Oklahoma City. But that would be his last time coming home. On July 25th, 1981, he celebrated the fiesta for St. James the Apostle. And so you can see it all decorated for the festival. That year they had a record 101 marriages and well over 200 First Communions. And then, so here's the rectory. So on the night of the 27th or the early morning hours of the 28th, while the church is still decorated from the festival, 3 masked men entered the rectory, located the room where he was at, and attempted to kidnap him. He had told his family he was not going to be kidnapped and tortured and left for his parishioners to find him in that normal pattern. And he put up a fight. He had bruises on his chest, his knuckles were skinned, his arm was in the upright position. And people, somebody did hear him say, "Just shoot me here," which is what they did. They shot him there and killed him in that room of the rectory. But he was quiet enough because he did not want to scare or put any of the people that lived in the rectory, any of the nuns or his assistant, in harm's way. So he was quiet. But there was a witness that sort of heard that, not in the room. Bullets were left in the floor, blood on the walls, and then he died instantly to a bullet to the head. Those 3 masked men then left the building without harming anyone else. They were never caught. So the murders have been attributed to the government. Oh. Quick little video here. Oh. Well, dang it. Sorry about that.
They started collecting his blood and put it in these jars. And that was one of the jars that was on the altar later. They knew that it was martyrdom from the beginning. As the word of his death traveled, hundreds and hundreds just showed up at the church.
Father had talked to the nuns in advance about what to do in the event of his death. And he had instructed them, and they followed through with this, to gather the people in the church and sing resurrection hymns with them. So they didn't want them to sort of have an uproar, and so they sang those throughout the night. They did save his blood and the bloody gauze, and we saw the picture of that on the altar. The first miracle, sort of anecdotally attributed to him, was actually as they were trying to clean up the body. The nuns were there, and it's July, and it's Guatemala in Central America. It was very hot, and rigor mortis was setting in very quickly. His arm, as I mentioned, was in a defensive position, and so it was very stiff, and they wanted to change his shirt, and so they said, "Come on, Stan, you have to help us." And his arm went limp, and they were able to change his shirt and sort of position it, and then rigor mortis set back in. So this, his heart is in Guatemala, as well as the blood and the bloody gauze. The people actually wanted to bury him there, and his family wanted to bury him back in Okarchi, where our ancestors are buried, where his brother and sister were buried, where his parents would eventually be buried. And so they struck a deal with the people that they would leave his heart in Guatemala and that his body would come back to Oklahoma. So the blood was put in a glass case with some of his possessions. And one of his successors at the mission was Father McSherry, and he unearthed a wooden box that had been deteriorated by a decay of moisture, and it just had turned to sawdust. The heart was in there and was enshrined inside in a black plastic sheath. So I think this was on the 10th anniversary of his death. And he says there was about a half-a-gallon jar with the blood in it, and the metal part of the jar had rusted, but the blood had not congealed. So he's now a priest. Father McSherry is in Oklahoma City. So then another excavation eyewitness, Reverend Greg Schaefer, was asked, hold on, I have to, let's see if I can do that, sorry. Oh, I think I lost some of my notes. I lost my notes, I apologize. They brought it up again, I think, on the 25th anniversary, and anyways, the blood is not congealed, the heart is still fresh. So it's kind of crazy. It's been relocated, but then there's a sign hanging above where it's enshrined, and I just love this. They put there is no greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. And that's truly what they believe that he did for them. Here is their funeral in Guatemala. And I am going to skip past the next video. And I'm just going to end. So we're going to miss a little bit to the end just from time. But I will tell you, so he was buried back in Okarchi. And then in May of last year, they exhumed his body, which is part of the beatification process. So they examined the body. They collected a rib bone for a relic. They wrapped it in sort of gold linens. I think they put his original linens back in and buried it. And you can see there's sort of a sign here now that says he's no longer at the seminary. He's temporarily interned at Resurrection Cemetery in Oklahoma City while they build a shrine to him. So then that's where he will be relocated, in Oklahoma City. I have lots of other great things, but in the interest of time, I think this is a really good stopping point. So there's lots of great things. I'm happy to take some questions or talk to you afterwards. I do have a relic up here that I can tell you about up here, and you can look and ask me questions or help yourself to anything on this table. So I don't know if you can read that, but this is the prayer for his cause of canonization, or if you had picked up a prayer card. But in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. O God, fount of all holiness, make us each walk worthily in our vocation, through the intercession of your saints, on whom you bestowed a great variety of graces on earth, having graced your church with the life and ministry of your missionary priest, Stanley Rother. By his intercession, grant that this humble flock may reach where the brave shepherd has gone. Grant that your church may proclaim him a saint, serving in your presence and interceding for us all. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the Father, and the Son, Holy Spirit. Amen.